His name was Tom Reynolds, 50 years old, a truck driver whose wife had just left him after 22 years of marriage. That night, exhausted and half drunk on loneliness, he was driving east through a freezing Kansas storm, convinced he had nothing left to live for. But then he saw someone standing barefoot on the shoulder, a man who shouldn't have survived a minute in that weather. Tom stopped, against every rule he'd ever lived by. The man climbed into his truck, said Tom's name before he'd even introduced himself. Hours later, police would confirm there was no one else on that road. So who did he pick up that night? And why did the storm stop the moment he let him in? Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's go back to that night when a broken man met a stranger who already knew him. By the time the first snow started to fall over western Kansas, Tom Reynolds had already been driving 13 hours straight, chasing a deadline that no longer mattered to anyone but the bank. The highway stretched ahead of him like a ribbon of ice, the kind of empty that made a man think too much. The dashboard clock blinked 10:14 p.m. He still had 200 miles to go, but it wasn't the distance that wore him down. It was the silence waiting at the other end. Somewhere back in Denver, a court envelope sat unopened on his kitchen counter, the kind of envelope that could take what was left of a man's life and measure it in monthly payments. His wife had stopped answering calls last week. His son, 17 and taller than him now, hadn't spoken since the day Tom missed his final baseball game. "You were always driving, Dad," the boy had said, not shouting, just stating it like a fact. "You drive away from everything." Tom hadn't known what to answer then, and tonight, grinding east through the sleet, he still didn't. The cab smelled of diesel, sweat, and the metallic tang of reheated coffee. A small photo of the three of them, Laura, Jake, and him, at a lake somewhere before things turned bad, was taped beside the speedometer. He kept glancing at it, even though the picture hurt. The snow thickened, catching the headlights in bright streaks. He turned the wipers up, listened to their uneven rhythm, and told himself he'd quit after this run, maybe take local routes, maybe try to fix what was left of home. But the words meant nothing over the sound of the wind battering the trailer. He thought he was just fighting the weather that night, but something else was waiting on that road, something that would change everything he believed about being lost and being found. The heater coughed out dry air that smelled faintly of antifreeze. The radio hissed, caught a station for half a second, a preacher's voice saying something about mercy in dark places, then dissolved back into static. He shut it off and leaned forward, the seatbelt biting his shoulder. The world outside was gray, endless, and moving sideways. Every mile felt heavier. He tried to call dispatch to report the storm, but the signal kept dropping. The phone buzzed with a message from Laura, just a single line he hadn't opened since morning. He didn't need to read it. He already knew the words, something about papers, signatures, the lawyer. He closed his eyes for a moment too long, and when he opened them, the road had narrowed into a tunnel of swirling white. He gripped the wheel tighter, the knuckles pale. The dashboard lights dimmed for half a second, then steadied again. Somewhere deep in the engine bay, a belt squealed under strain. He eased off the gas, watching the snow build up along the wiper edges like ash. There was no music, no voice, nothing human in the cab but his own breathing. He thought about turning back to Colby, about finding a motel and sleeping off the storm, but pride kept him moving. He'd spent 25 years proving he could outlast the road, and now it was the only thing that still listened to him. Outside, the landscape vanished into gray. The trailer lights behind him blurred in the mirrors, two red smears in the dark. He rolled his shoulders, stretched one arm, and felt the dull pull of fatigue in his spine. The thermos was empty. He reached for it anyway, shook it, set it down. The cold was creeping in through the floor panels. He saw the shape when he wasn't looking for it, just a flicker at first, a darker patch against the snow. Then the headlights caught it full, and it was unmistakably a man walking along the shoulder. No hat, no gloves, just a thin coat clinging to him in the wind. Tom blinked, thinking it was a trick of the snow. But when he slowed, the figure didn't fade. It kept moving forward, one step after another, head bent, dragging a small bag behind him. He hit the hazards, their red light flashing across the white landscape. The truck's brakes hissed as he brought it to a stop. He sat there for a few seconds, listening to the engine idle, the sound of wind against the door, and the distant hum of the highway fading into nothing. He told himself not to get involved. Drivers had stories about this sort of thing, hitchhikers that vanished, setups for robbery, all kinds of danger. But the figure ahead wasn't a threat. It was barely standing. The man turned once, slowly, as if he'd known the truck would stop all along. Tom felt something he hadn't in a long time, a tug of simple human duty, quiet but undeniable. He exhaled, unbuckled, and leaned over to roll down the window halfway. Cold air rushed in, biting his face. "You need help?" he called out. The man nodded once, his voice low, almost steady against the wind. "Just trying to get home." "To where?" "Wichita." Tom stared at him, then at the road ahead, a white corridor fading into dark. "That's 200 miles east." "I know," the man said, "but my mother's waiting." Tom hesitated, fingers drumming on the wheel. He wasn't sure if it was the way the man spoke or the way he looked directly at him through the snow, calm, unblinking, almost certain, but something in that moment made him unlock the passenger door. "Get in," he said. "You'll freeze out there." The man climbed up carefully, shut the door without sound, and sat with his hands resting on his knees. His clothes were soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead, yet he didn't shiver. He just looked ahead, breathing slow, eyes fixed on the road as if he already knew where it led. Tom put the truck back in gear and eased onto the lane again. The wipers scraped, the trailer groaned, the engine found its rhythm. The stranger said nothing. For the first time in hours, Tom realized the heater had started to blow warm again. The truck moved through the storm like a ship cutting through a dark sea, its headlights the only light left in a world that seemed to have folded in on itself. The snow wasn't falling anymore. It was floating, drifting in thick waves that made the highway feel endless and close at once. Inside the cab, warmth began to seep back into the air vents, the hum of the engine soft but steady, and Tom realized he could finally feel his hands again. He didn't remember turning the heater back on. The stranger sat still beside him, his soaked clothes steaming faintly in the heat, his face half lit by the dashboard glow. But what happened in that quiet hour between two men on an empty road would leave him questioning everything he thought he understood about mercy. Tom tried to focus on driving. The snow on the asphalt blurred into a long gray ribbon, the tire tracks already vanishing behind them. He could hear the faint tap of ice breaking off the mirrors, the hum of the tires, and under it, the slow rhythm of breathing that wasn't his. The man had folded his hands neatly on his lap. His fingernails were rimmed with dirt, his knuckles raw, but there was a stillness about him that felt out of place in this storm. "You been walking long?" Tom asked after a few minutes. His voice sounded rough, older than he expected. 2 days, maybe 3, the man said, as if time didn't matter much anymore. "From where?" "West." He smiled faintly, not looking away from the road. "Farther than I should have tried to go on foot." Tom nodded, though the answer gave him nothing. "You said you're headed to Wichita." "Yes, my mother's there. She's waiting." "For Christmas?" The man tilted his head. "For me." Tom waited for him to say more, but the man seemed content with silence. The storm eased for a moment, opening a thin patch of sky. The moon broke through like a dim coin behind gauze, lighting the snowdrifts on either side of the highway. For the first time in hours, Tom could see more than a few hundred feet ahead. He felt the tension ease in his chest. "You got a name?" he asked. "David." "David," Tom repeated, as if testing it. "You picked a hell of a night to be out walking, David." David smiled slightly. "Sometimes the night picks you." They drove on. The heater's low hum filled the silence. Tom checked the fuel gauge. It was dropping faster than it should have been. He'd filled the tank only 2 hours ago, but it already hovered near a quarter. He made a note to refuel at the next open station, if there was one. Outside, the storm gathered again. The wind began to whistle through the cracks of the door seals, soft and high, like someone trying to get their attention. Tom tightened his grip on the wheel. "You hear that?" "It's just the wind," David said quietly. "Yeah," Tom muttered, though he wasn't sure. The road began to climb slightly, curving through low hills. The headlights caught a jackknifed semi ahead, half buried in snow, its trailer folded like a broken wing across both lanes. Tom slowed, hazard lights pulsing red against the whiteness. The driver's door of the wrecked truck hung open, the cab empty, no movement anywhere. The sight of it sent a small chill through him that had nothing to do with temperature. David watched in silence. When they passed, he said softly, "He'll be fine." Tom turned to him. "How do you know that?" "I don't," David said. "But I believe it." There was something so matter-of-fact in the way he said it that Tom didn't reply. He just pressed the accelerator, guiding the truck slowly past the wreck until the tail lights of the other rig disappeared behind them. The radio flickered suddenly to life. Half a word, a burst of static, then silence again. Tom reached out instinctively to adjust the dial, but David stopped him with a quiet voice. "Leave it. The silence is safer." Tom hesitated, his hand still on the knob. He let go. They stayed quiet for a while. The storm outside thickened once more, wind pushing the trailer sideways until Tom eased the speed down to 30. He could barely see the center line now. His eyes burned from the effort of staring through snow. The clock on the dashboard had stopped at 12:01. He tapped it once with his finger. It flicked, then resumed ticking like nothing had happened. He exhaled slowly. "Strange night," he said, trying to make it sound casual. David looked at him, his expression unreadable. "Every night is strange when you forget to look for light." Tom didn't know how to answer that. He'd met talkers before, people who rode along for an hour, preaching about signs or fate until he dropped them off at the next gas station. But this man's voice wasn't like that. It wasn't heavy or dramatic. It was calm, too calm, as if the words weren't meant to teach but to remind. For a moment, Tom wondered if he should ask what David did before he ended up here. But before he could speak, a faint glimmer caught his eye. A small orange light flickered ahead, low to the ground, half hidden by the snow. He leaned forward. It wasn't a vehicle, too steady for that. Maybe a lamp from a rest stop or a small gas station. David looked toward it as well and said quietly, "That's where we should stop." Tom glanced at him. "You sure? Looks closed." "It will still help us." The words were strange, but his tone was certain. Tom slowed, guiding the truck toward the light. It came from a single bulb above an old service station, the kind built decades ago. Flat roof, peeling paint, a single bay door half buried under snow. The pumps were rusted, numbers unreadable. Yet the bulb above the door burned bright and steady, untouched by wind. Tom parked under the canopy. The snow hissed softly against the hood. When he cut the engine, the silence settled heavy around them. He could hear the tick of cooling metal and his own heartbeat, slow and uneven. David unbuckled, still composed. "We can rest a bit," he said. Tom grabbed his flashlight from the glove compartment. The beam sliced through the cold air, revealing the glass door of the station, fogged and streaked. He pushed it open. The hinges creaked, echoing in the dark. Inside smelled of dust and rain-soaked wood. Old shelves lined the walls, mostly empty except for a cracked coffee pot and a few plastic cups. He swept the beam across the floor, no footprints but their own. He pulled a folding chair upright and sat. David followed, setting his duffel on the counter. For the first time, Tom noticed how light it was when the man carried it, as if it held nothing at all. "You been on the road long?" Tom asked, more to fill the quiet than out of curiosity. David nodded. "Long enough to forget where I started." "That's a dangerous way to travel." "Not if you know where you're going." The heater's hum still lingered in Tom's ears from the cab, so the silence here felt sharper. He rubbed his hands together, trying to warm them. "You got family in Wichita, right?" "My wife and little girl," David said softly. "Anna and Grace." Tom looked up from his hands. "Grace. That's a good name." David nodded again, eyes unfocused, as if he could see something through the wall. "She laughs like her mother. I can hear her when the wind slows." Tom followed his gaze toward the window. The snow outside had almost stopped, and for the first time all night, the air seemed to hold its breath. He didn't know what to say. Something about the way David spoke made the simplest words feel sacred. The flashlight dimmed and went out. He tapped it against his palm. Nothing. When he turned, the light above the door flickered once, bright white for just a second, then steadied again. The room filled with that faint warm glow, enough to see by, though he couldn't tell where it came from. David stood. "You should call your wife when the line comes back," he said. "She's waiting by the window." Tom froze. "How would you—" He stopped himself, unsure whether to finish the question. The man didn't look at him. He was staring out into the storm again. Tom rubbed his temples, trying to push away the creeping unease. Maybe he'd mentioned Laura earlier and forgotten. Maybe fatigue was making him read into things. He took a breath and looked down at his watch. The second hand wasn't moving. He tapped the glass. Still nothing. He rose from the chair, walked toward the window, and looked out. The light from the truck's hazard flashers reflected off the snow in slow pulses of red. Each blink illuminated the tracks they'd left leading up to the canopy, except now there were only one set. He blinked again, leaned closer to the glass. One line of footprints. His. He turned back toward the counter, but David was already standing near the door, duffel over his shoulder, ready to leave. "The wind's letting up," he said. "It's time." Tom swallowed. "You sure you want to walk again?" "I won't be walking far." Tom followed him to the door. The bulb above them flickered once more, casting long shadows across the snow. He hesitated, then reached for the ignition keys in his pocket. "You want me to drive you at least a few miles?" David smiled, faint but genuine. "If you drive where the road leads, I'll be with you." The words made no sense, but Tom found himself nodding anyway. He started the engine, the headlights cutting through the last of the flurries, the world ahead washed clean and bright. No one could have imagined what he was about to witness on that road, least of all him. They pulled out of the station and turned east, the tires crushing fresh snow. Behind them, the old light above the door went dark. The storm was gone now, leaving a thin mist that hung low over the fields. The only sound was the steady pulse of the engine and, somewhere faintly, the rhythm of two voices breathing in time. And as the highway opened before them, the clock on the dashboard began to tick again, quietly, perfectly on beat with the road beneath them. The highway narrowed into darkness as they left the faint glow of the abandoned station behind them, the truck's headlights stretching out across a long corridor of fog that seemed to rise directly from the earth. The storm had passed, but its memory clung to everything. The smell of wet asphalt, the thin mist on the mirrors, the chill that lingered even inside the cab where the heater hummed steady and low. Tom drove with both hands on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the faint curve of the road as it dipped and disappeared between the fields. David sat beside him, quiet again, his presence calm, almost steadying, like a low note that made the silence around it feel intentional. But what neither man could explain was why the sky itself seemed to follow them now, the clouds moving as if drawn toward the same unseen point on the map. For miles, they said nothing. The world outside was stripped of color, just shades of gray and faint blue, and every few minutes the light caught something metallic along the roadside, a broken fence post, a frozen puddle, a piece of rusted machinery half buried in snow. Tom could hear the soft grind of salt beneath the tires, the occasional thump of ice falling from the undercarriage. He wanted to ask questions, who David really was, why he'd been out there, but he didn't. It was as if the air between them had settled into a truce built on quiet. He rubbed his eyes, blinked against the ache behind them, and shifted in the seat. The fatigue he'd been fighting for hours had vanished, not just eased, gone. He felt alert, clear, as though his body had been reset. The only sound breaking the rhythm of the engine was the ticking of the dashboard clock, now perfectly synchronized with the wiper blades. "You sure you're not cold?" he asked finally. David shook his head once. "No." Tom glanced at him again. The man's thin coat was still damp, but there was no sign of shivering. He looked forward with that same unblinking calm, his eyes steady on the faint white lines that slipped beneath them. They crossed a narrow bridge, the sound of rushing water faint below, and when the tires hit the other side, Tom noticed something strange. The air outside had changed. It smelled like rain, but also faintly of wood smoke, the kind that comes from a far-off fire that's been burning for hours. He rolled down the window an inch. The cold air rushed in sharp against his face. The scent was real. He looked at the clock, 1:24 a.m., and wondered where they even were. The GPS was still blank. No coordinates, no map. Just a frozen screen reflecting his own tired face. David turned his head slightly. "You're not lost," he said. "I didn't say I was." "You were thinking it." Tom looked at him again. "You always talk like that?" David smiled barely. Only when people ask. Tom huffed through his nose, a tired half-laugh. You're a strange one, David's voice softened. Not stranger than the roads you've been on. The words hit harder than they should have. Tom looked ahead again, the world narrowing to a tunnel of fog. He remembered nights sleeping in the cab outside truck stops, Christmases alone at rest areas, phone calls that ended before they began. The road had been his only constant, faithful, endless, unforgiving. Lightning flared in the distance, silent, far away, casting for an instant the outline of the fields around them. He saw water pooled in the ditches, black and still, and beyond that, the skeletal shapes of barns and grain silos. For a moment, everything was silver, the kind of light that makes the world look like it's holding its breath. Then it was gone, leaving only the faint afterimage burned behind his eyelids. No one could have imagined what he was about to see next, not even him. A single farmhouse light appeared in the distance, flickering like a small heartbeat against the horizon. Tom slowed instinctively. You see that? Yes, David said. We're close. To what? My mother's house. Tom frowned. You sure? We're miles from Wichita. David didn't answer. He just kept his eyes fixed on that light ahead, and for a moment, Tom wondered if he was sleep-talking, if exhaustion had finally caught up with both of them. But the light grew brighter as they drew near, steady now, cutting through the mist. They turned off the main road onto a narrow lane lined with wooden posts buried in snow. The tires crunched through slush and gravel. Tom could feel the incline change, the truck leaning slightly as it followed the bend. On either side, the fields were wide and silent, water glistening under the weak moon. Feels like no one's lived out here in years, Tom murmured. Some people never leave, David said quietly. The lane ended at a wooden gate. Beyond it stood a small farmhouse, pale in the headlights, the single porch lamp glowing gold through the fog. The snow on its roof glimmered faintly. There were no other lights, no vehicles, no movement. Tom pulled to a stop a few yards away and killed the engine. The sudden silence pressed in heavy. He heard only the soft ping of cooling metal and the whisper of drizzle against the hood. David turned toward him. Thank you for the ride. That it? Tom asked. You want me to wait? David shook his head. You've already brought me home. Tom hesitated. You sure this is the place? Yes. He picked up his duffel and opened the door. The cabin light came on, washing his face in a warm glow that made him look different, rested, almost radiant in the faint reflection of snow. He stepped down carefully and closed the door. Tom watched him walk through the gate and up the narrow path to the porch. The old wood creaked under his feet. When he reached the door, he knocked once. The light inside flickered, then grew brighter. A figure appeared, an older woman in a long cardigan, her hair silver, her shape thin but upright. She opened the door before he spoke, and without hesitation, stepped forward and embraced him. The gesture was slow, familiar, inevitable, like something that had been rehearsed 1,000 times in waiting. Tom blinked, leaned forward on the wheel, trying to see more clearly through the fogged glass. The porch light flared once, stronger, then softer, and when it steadied again, they were gone. The doorway was empty, the house quiet. He frowned, rubbed the windshield with his sleeve, but the view didn't change. The light was still there, warm and golden, flickering slightly like a candle seen through heavy rain. He turned the key halfway, thinking to drive closer, but the fuel gauge caught his eye. The needle, which had been nearly empty, now rested firmly at full. He stared at it, motionless, the sound of his heartbeat filling the small space around him. For a long time, he sat there, unsure whether to move or pray or wake himself from whatever dream he'd stumbled into. The mist outside thinned gradually, the shapes of the road and the gate re-emerging in quiet detail. The scent of wood smoke grew stronger, wrapping around him like memory. He reached up and touched the small cross hanging from the mirror. It was warm against his fingertips. What happened next would remain with him for the rest of his life, though in that moment he had no name for it, only the certainty that something had shifted in the air, as if the world had taken a breath and was waiting for him to do the same. He turned the ignition fully. The engine started smooth, steady, as though it had just rolled off the line. The wipers brushed the last of the drizzle from the glass. When he looked toward the house again, the porch light was out. The sky beyond the fields was beginning to pale, not sunrise yet, but close. He shifted into gear, the tires gripping the wet ground, and guided the truck slowly back down the lane. The mist curled in around the headlights, soft and weightless. He didn't check the mirrors. He didn't need to. The road ahead was enough. And somewhere far off, beyond where the headlights reached, a low wind moved through the fields, carrying with it the faint smell of roses, there, then gone, as if the night itself had exhaled. By the time Tom reached the outskirts of Phoenix, the day had stretched into a long, glowing band of orange along the horizon. The interstate was still wet from scattered showers, and every puddle he passed caught the reflection of the sky, turning the asphalt into a mirror of slow-moving light. He had driven through the night without stopping, not out of habit this time, but because something inside him wouldn't allow him to rest until he saw home again. The world looked cleaner than he remembered it, as if the storm that had followed him out of Kansas had rinsed more than the roads. He could feel the weight of exhaustion deep in his bones, but under it was something new, a quiet certainty that he was heading in the right direction at last. The city began to rise in the distance, hazy through the heat already lifting from the pavement. The familiar skyline brought an ache that was half dread, half longing. He hadn't seen his house in weeks. He didn't know if his wife would open the door or even want to. He didn't know what he would say. But he knew that running was finished. The road had done what it needed to do. It had brought him back. He exited onto a quieter stretch of road lined with palm trees and low stucco houses the color of sand. The closer he got, the slower he drove. He passed the gas station where he used to buy coffee before sunrise, the elementary school where he once waited in the truck to watch his son run laps with the team. The street looked the same, but everything inside him had changed. He parked across from the house, turned off the engine, and let the silence come. The windows of the home were dim except for one light near the kitchen, soft and golden. He could see movement through the curtains. Laura, her hair pulled back, standing at the counter. For a moment he just sat there, hands resting on the wheel, trying to breathe through the rush of guilt and longing that rose in him all at once. The sound of his heartbeat filled the cab. He took off his cap, ran a hand through his hair, and stepped out. The evening air was warm, carrying the faint scent of damp earth after rain. Every sound was amplified, the creak of the truck door, the click of his boots on the sidewalk, the rustle of a palm leaf in the wind. He crossed the yard slowly, feeling each step like it might wake something sleeping beneath the soil. He stopped at the porch and hesitated. The house seemed smaller than he remembered, almost fragile. He lifted his hand and knocked twice, soft, unsure. For a few seconds, nothing moved. Then the door opened a few inches, and Laura stood there in the yellow light. She looked exactly as she had in his memory, but her expression carried the quiet wariness of someone who has learned not to expect much. "Tom," she said, his name small in the space between them. He nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hey, Laura." They stood there for a long moment, the sound of the cicadas rising and falling like a slow tide. He wanted to speak, but couldn't find words that didn't sound too small. Finally, he said, "I was on my way east, but I had to come home first." Her eyes searched his face, the lines, the exhaustion, the kind of truth that only hard nights could carve. "You look different," she said quietly. "I feel different," he answered. "I don't want to keep living like I've been. I can't. I just want to fix what I broke, even if it takes the rest of my life." She didn't speak at first. Then she stepped back slowly and opened the door wider. "Come in," she said. The house smelled like coffee and laundry detergent, like warmth and time. He followed her into the kitchen where the small lamp by the counter cast a soft circle of light. A mug sat there half full. The sound of rain from earlier still echoed faintly on the roof. From the hallway came the sound of a door opening. His son appeared, taller than the last time he had seen him, his hair longer, his eyes uncertain. "Mom," the boy said, stopping when he saw his father. Tom couldn't move for a moment. "Hey, Jake," he managed. The boy hesitated, then came closer. "You came back." "I did," Tom said. "I should have come sooner." Jake stood there, arms crossed, eyes wet though he tried to hide it. Then, quietly, he nodded. "Mom said you'd find your way home one day." Tom swallowed hard, his throat tight. She was right. Laura stood beside them, her hand resting lightly on the counter, watching the two of them with something like disbelief and relief tangled together. The air in the kitchen felt alive with something unspoken but real. No one said the word forgiveness, but it hung there anyway, present, patient, waiting to be claimed. He reached out his hand, unsure what his son would do. The boy looked at it for a long second, then stepped forward and wrapped his arms around his father. Tom closed his eyes, feeling the small tremor of that embrace, the smell of his son's hair, the steady rhythm of his heart against his chest. Laura's breath caught softly somewhere behind them. Outside, the last of the daylight slipped beneath the horizon, and the street lamps flickered to life one by one. Through the kitchen window, Tom could see the reflection of the three of them standing together, framed by the same golden light that had once filled the farmhouse doorway miles away. He didn't understand how it all connected, and he didn't need to. Some things weren't meant to be explained, only lived, remembered, and quietly cherished. He sat at the table later while Laura reheated dinner. The air smelled of bread and coffee, and the faint sweetness of rain-soaked air drifting in from the yard. Jake talked about school, about things he had missed, small stories that felt miraculous in their normalcy. Tom listened to every word, nodding slowly, afraid to interrupt. He reached for the coffee she poured for him, the cup warm in his hands. When he looked toward the window again, a small beam of moonlight crossed the counter, illuminating the surface where Laura's wedding ring lay beside the sink. She picked it up absently, turned it once between her fingers, then slipped it back on. Tom closed his eyes for a moment and whispered, "Thank you," though he wasn't sure to whom he was speaking anymore. The house felt full again, not loud or busy, but full in the way a heart fills after being empty for too long. Sometimes grace doesn't arrive in visions or lightning or voices from heaven. Sometimes it waits behind a door you once closed yourself, asking quietly to be opened again. The hardest journeys are often the ones that lead us back to where we began, to the people who still choose to love us in spite of the storms we bring with us. It takes courage to drive home after losing your way, and faith to believe that someone will still be there when you do. But when love meets you at the door, you realize that forgiveness was never about being worthy. It was about being willing. Let us pray for those who are still far from home, for the weary souls afraid to return, and for the hearts that wait patiently at windows and doors. May God grant us the humility to ask for forgiveness and the strength to offer it when it is sought. May every road that begins in loneliness end in reunion, and may every family divided by silence find the courage to speak again. Lord, teach us that no distance is greater than your mercy, and no night too long for your dawn to reach. Let our hearts be homes of peace, our words instruments of healing, and our love reflections of yours. Amen. If this story touched you, share in the comments where you've seen mercy bring someone home. Tell us how faith helped you rebuild something you thought was lost. Send this story to someone who needs a reason to believe that reconciliation is still possible. And if you still trust that love can find its way through any storm, let your light shine in the comments below. Thank you for watching. God bless you. And may you always find your way back to the door that love never stopped leaving open.